Okay, good morning, Gareth. Episode
Hello.
2 of the weekly Crypto Financial Promotions podcast from Engelbert. Very
That's
excited.
our name now. Have we chosen that?
It
The
doesn't roll.
weekly financial promotions podcast from Engelbert.
It doesn't
It's
roll off
got a
the
ring.
tongue, does it? But I think that's what we're going to have to go with.
Okay, I'll take it.
Good. So last week, I think we covered some of the basics, a bit of the intro to the regime. So we're going to get into a bit more detail this time. And I thought maybe, Gareth, we could talk about frictions,
Love some frictions.
which sounds negative but has some positive consequences. So give us a rundown quickly of what frictions means in this context.
Quickly, crikey, Wayne. Okay, so frictions are a set of rules introduced to ensure that consumers, when going through a purchase journey for crypto, are slowed down in that process, and the outcome is therefore that they don't like trade from FOMO or emotionally just buy something they haven't thought about properly. And the reason for that is that these are high risk investments, and so it's not appropriate that you should just be able to dive straight in and buy a load and then immediately regret it, particularly with the consequences of high volatility, etc., that you could experience. And so there are four frictions. Uh, they, in various orders, are a personalised risk warning, a investor categorisation, appropriateness assessment, and a 24-hour cooling off period. And I think we'll probably be able to go into each one of those, right?
Yeah, I should think so. And maybe useful just to cover what might be wrong, what might go bad without the frictions, just to give it a bit of context around the protections the FCA are looking to give. So as you said, high risk investments, don't want people steamrolling into doing something without fully understanding the risks of it and fully understanding what it is that they're doing anyway. And it kind of points to something the FCA talk about a little bit more now than they used to, which is behaviours and behaviours of customers, and the frictions, as the name suggests, are there, as you said, to slow things down a little bit and just make sure that there are steps taken for people to get through. So before the personalised risk warning, people have to do what? Because it's quite prescribed, isn't it? The frictions requirements in the FCA rules.
Woof, this feels like a test, Wayne. Okay. So they have to, so in order for the frictions to first appear, you have to obviously be trying to do a controlled activity. And we should be clear here that frictions only apply in respect of direct offer financial promotions, those ones that have a standard form of response, those ones that are effectively the buy button or the exchange button or the sell button. So they only appear there. And they will have to read the personalized risk warning, and in doing so, usually that personalized risk warning will say, "Hey, Wayne, did you know this is a high risk investment and you might lose all the money you invested?" That's not, I don't think, the actual wording, but it's pretty close. Take 2 minutes to learn more, and then send people off to the risk summary. And at that point, you would say, I am prepared to see the direct offer financial promotion at the end of this journey. And I confirm that by clicking this button, or however they choose to implement it, that I'm going to go on a journey that gets me towards a financial promotion. Is that the right answer? Did I pass?
Correct answer.
Thank you. Okay, so then there's a bit of a question of sequencing, and I don't know whether we do that now or a bit later, but there is a sort of question of sequencing and where these things fit in the overall journey, whether there are gaps in between the stages, whether they're all brought together. I know we've done some thinking on this with some clients and based on some questions from the FCA, so I wondered if it might be worth just diving into that.
Yeah, and interesting, I guess, is that the sense we got was not that the frictions have to be creating maximum friction in the sequence, but that there is some desire for it to be let's not say easy because that gives the wrong impression, but it has to be a journey that customers can follow through well. And it's not a case of trying to stop them from doing something all the time. It's trying to see them through the frictions process, but all the while ensuring that they understand the risks and what they're getting into, and that it's not too easy for them to find themselves deep into something that which they never intended to be.
Yeah, that's right. So, jargon alert, these are restricted mass market investments, and that means it's okay to sell them to the mass market as long as the way you do that is restricted in some way so that it isn't as easy as just log in, create a user account, click a load of buy buttons. But you've got actually some steps in that process to bring that to a slower, more considered approach by the user. Personalized risk warning, prescribed text. There's a link at the end of that text to a risk summary. One thing to think about will always be, what is the text on that risk summary, right? Is it your generic one for your platform? Is it actually the generic one the FCA provides? Or is it specific based on some clever use of your systems, which knows what sort of product you're about to do some investment activity in, and therefore displays a risk summary that is specific to that type of activity or that type of investment?
And what drives that decision, I guess, as to what's in there is how the firms that adopt this do adopt this regime and in what spirit. So there are prescribed requirements, of course, in the regs, but then there are elements, as you've just said, where there is a little more judgment to be taken as to what goes in. And really, if you put yourself in the position of a customer and work out what do I actually need to know, then that should help drive what spits out the other end in terms of personalised risk warnings, etc. As opposed to just, well, the FCA have put these words on paper, so I'm going to use those. That's kind of your start point, I think, as opposed to your tick box end point.
And I was probably a bit surprised by the implementation of those rules, because I would have thought that the FCA preferred firms to use their standard wording, which is, literally set out in the rule book, right? But in most cases, I think we've seen the opposite. That actually, because the rules say, either use this standard wording, except where you deem it appropriate not to do so, and to have your own bespoke one, which sort of suggested to me that there's a default option of use ours, but in exceptional circumstances, if you think that yours is necessary, then use yours. But actually, it's sort of the opposite, isn't it?
And that's why I think as a start point, that works, because then you know that you've taken what the FCA's initial expectation is on wording that they've come up with, and you can adopt it and adapt from there, as opposed to just slavishly following it.
Yes. Yeah, agreed. Okay, so then you come away from the personalised risk warning into the next step. Now, in the FCA's diagram of this, we can link to it in the show notes. The next thing that appears is the investor categorisation, right? And in a way, this is almost a bit of friction for both parties, because what the investor categorisation says is, hey, you, investor, need to tell the provider what sort of investor you are. And you've got three options to choose from. Either to say that you're a high net worth, that you're a sophisticated investor, a certified sophisticated investor, or that you are a restricted investor, which is the catch-all for everybody else. But actually, the friction here is also a little bit on the provider, right? Because the key thing here is that the provider should know who their market is and who they're dealing with as actual customers, because it's all well and good having a strategy to go to market to try and find certain clients, but then suddenly if you find that you thought you were going after sophisticated clients, but everybody who's signed up is restricted, then that changes your own marketing approach, right? You're going to have to be a little bit more nuanced in how you target those people.
Yeah, and probably a word on why those three categories exist because they're very familiar to people who've been in financial services for any length of time, but anyone new to it maybe less aware. But the three categories exist purely because we need to understand, especially when it's a high risk investment, what experience, what knowledge, what perhaps capacity for loss different people are able to bear. And the ways of doing that is determining whether they are high net worth, certified sophisticated, and sophisticated is appointed to knowledge as opposed to how they dress and what car they drive. And then everybody else, as you say, just catches the remainder, where you make an assumption that they know little to nothing about what it is they're investing in, and so you've got to fill that gap for them.
And I suppose it's worth pointing out that there are clients that will drop off the bottom of that entirely, and they would be clients that this product or service would be unsuitable for. And that's dictated largely by their expected or proposed investment levels. Mm-hmm. So, the FCA say a restricted investor should certify as part of the process that they have not in the past 12 months invested more than 10% of their net assets, excluding their main residence, in crypto, and that for the next 12 months they won't. Now, as part of the build of this, and this is always a build for clients, right, for people who are trying to access the market, there's always this question of how much guidance do you give in that process, because obviously you're going to have a form to be filled out by the user, and it's prescribed form wording, and then because it'll be electronic, you'll have a text box to say how much of your net assets will you invest in the next 12 months. And most developers will want to have a validation on that field, right, which will be either number should not be less than 0 and greater than 10, which of course coaches people to then put the right number in, and that's not permissible, right? But equally, do you go the other way and say there's still a validation, but it's the number must be less than 1 trillion? Or do you just not have any validation at all, but after they've submitted that form, then you say, you've put in that you intend to invest 30% of your net assets in the next 12 months.
And that coaching point's an important one, because that runs through everything on these frictions. Is you've got to come back to the purpose of it. And the purpose is no business should want people to engage with them if they don't know what they're doing, or it's not suitable for them because of the risk or the capacity for loss or whatever that might be. You just don't want that. And so there's a very sort of strict feeling from the regulator that coaching is bad. And I can understand that, because if you just sort of guide people through the frictions with the view of getting them to the other side so that you can sell them stuff, that's not the right outcome. The right outcome is that they understand what's happening all the way through. They fill it out honestly. They give an accurate representation of who they are and what their standing is, so that at the end you've got a good market that understands what they're buying, and you're probably going to end up with better customers anyway, because now they know what they're there for, as opposed to getting any kind of surprises. So yeah, definitely it's getting that balance between making it fit and work in a nice process of frictionless frictions. Is that a way we can express it? But yeah, without giving them the answers, basically, so that they give you whatever it is that they need to give you to get the other side, as opposed to giving you the truthful responses.
Yeah, that's right. And as part of that process, for builders out there who are building these frictions, ultimately the key thing to note is that there are, as part of this categorisation process, a series of statements that you have to show, a series of data entry points that you have to collect, and then an investor statement at the end that has the investor confirming that they, are happy that they meet the categorisation, and that on that basis, this is the level of protection that they get, which is ultimately sort of none, and that they're happy to, transact with the provider on that basis. And that's all stipulated wording. It's just when you come to technologise something that is just a paper-based set of rules and words at the minute, that then you start to get into that coaching and validation piece that does need a bit of nuance and thinking about to get it right.
Just one point,
But
I
then,
guess. Sorry, go on.
oh yeah, no, please.
So one point, I was going to say one more point on the categorisation bit before we look at the appropriateness assessment, and that's the um, certified sophisticated investor bit, where some of the other categories, like you've talked about, are investors inputting their details, how much they want to invest or intend to or not, etc. Is them providing the information, and then the system basically validating it, doing what it will with the wrong answers and the right answers. Certified sophisticated is someone saying, here's proof in certificate form from an entity that I understand the complexities of these kind of investments or any kind of investments, and therefore I am fine to be categorized in that respect. And what we know is that just providing a certificate in isolation is not enough. You can't say that's, again, as we've said before, a box ticked. They've given me a certificate. What the expectation is that there's some scrutiny of that certificate and some check that A, it's valid and accurate and real and someone's actually provided it. B, that the company providing it exists and is real and meant to do that. And C, that it's actually relevant. So I think an example we talked about, didn't we, when we had a meeting recently, was someone saying that they are an experienced investor, and here's the proof, and it's from a firm that's regulated by the FCA, but regulated to provide credit for motor vehicle purchases. Well, that doesn't really show that you're experienced in high risk investments like crypto, and so is that really a relevant an applicable certificate or not?
Yeah, that's right. And I think we know, don't we, that the FCA care currently about finding out who's giving these certificates out, particularly for people who say that they want it for the context of crypto transactions. So yeah, do be mindful, I suppose, that there's a validation process in the work, in the pipeline that takes that certificate in and does something with it, and that there's scrutiny of the person that's provided it, not the person, not the investor in that case, but actually the certificating entity sitting behind them, to make sure that they are the right sort of entity. So yeah, you're absolutely right to bring that up.
And something I think we'd be interested to know when people implement certified certificated as an option is why have that as an option as well, because what is it that the more catch-all version does to investors and provides to investors that you might not want to have to certified certificated, and why would you have that category at all? And there are perfectly valid good answers for that. It's not a no, but it's just good to understand that.
And then I suppose there's probably a little gold star exercise to do once you've got that categorization information in, because it's all well and good to say, great, we went through the process and we know that we've got 70% restricted, 20% sophisticated, and 10% high net worth. What do you actually do with that information? And the gold star exercise is to sort of look through the services and products that you're offering and say, are there some that actually shouldn't go to restricted retail clients, that should only be sent to the high net worths or the sophisticated clients who can demonstrate they actually know what they're doing. That's not going to be true in most cases. There is an argument that your platform could just be appropriate for retail, and that's fine. But if you can demonstrate you've thought about that and maybe you've limited certain features, then that would be the gold star answer if the FCA ever probably came and asked.
So the next step, appropriateness assessment, where the firms are expected to then, I guess, check that the customers understand what it is they're doing. And that's through an assessment or a test or whatever you want to call it, but not anything too exciting sounding, I guess, like a challenge or a quiz. And the, again, purpose of that is to assess the knowledge of the customers and make sure they know what they're getting into, as opposed to making things so easy it looks like a Good Morning Britain daytime TV show quiz where the answer is so very obvious that it may as well not even be called a test. It's just really a phone-in, and it's got to make sure it's testing people reasonably, but not, again, as we said earlier, making the frictions process so hard that nobody ever passes through it.
Yeah, and this is the challenge with with people that want to get into the market and build these things is that you'll have your developers on the one hand saying, oh, it's too hard, it's too difficult, we need to make sure people pass because we need to make sure we get user retention. UI is all about keeping people engaged and keeping people in the process and in the app for as long as possible, versus sort of the point of this test, which is to weed out those people that don't actually know the answers to these questions. I mean, I've written, maybe 2 sets, maybe 3 sets of these questions, and it is hard to write those questions. It's a really difficult exercise because every answer has to be a legitimate sounding answer despite being wrong, apart from obviously the one right one. And one of the examples that the FCA give of like good and bad practice in this space is like bad practice is where your right answer is a paragraph and all the wrong answers are like 2 words, and it's clear that there's where the nuance is there is the right answer. That's a very easy pit to fall into. And what's important as well is actually what's tested. So you've got, and again, sorry, this is a handbook reference alert, COBS 10 Annex 4 has a list of 12 topics that you have to assess every client on as part of this appropriateness assessment. And that's really hard because often you won't ask 12 questions. So you're going to want to batch some of those topics together. And so therefore, every question has to have an element of assessing all of the topics that the Annex 4 requires you to ask or that you've chosen to batch together, so that you can always say, yes, every client that's taken this test has always had a set of questions that addresses all those 12 points, no matter which random questions we throw at them from the relevant sections. So that's really one of the hardest bits. But I suppose the other bit is scoring, right?
Where, as you said, the need to test all of the different subjects, all the different categories that COBS covers, plus not making this a friction that has so much friction nobody can get through it, but equally tests everybody's knowledge. Then the question is, well, can anyone get any questions wrong and still pass the test? And if they can get them wrong, what can they get wrong? How many can they get wrong? And what might that mean for them in terms of the assessment? And I think we've sort of got to a point where it's a balanced decision. So the more questions you have, the easier it is to cover the categories, but the longer the frictions process is. Also, the more detailed and granular the questions are on their subjects, then maybe the more you can accept a wrong answer and give people the right answer at the end, just to bring them up to speed or tell them where they went wrong, but still pass through it, versus very few questions where you're going to have less appetite for incorrect answers, because if you've tried to cover 2 or 3 of the COBS elements in one question and they got it wrong, well, that's not just one thing they've perhaps misunderstood. It could be 2 or 3 things that they've maybe misunderstood.
Yeah, it's totally right. So you've got that balance, right, between asking loads of questions and allowing 1 or 2 wrong answers versus asking fewer questions, but every wrong answer is a higher proportion of the overall topics that have been effectively answered incorrectly there. So a balance seems to be that 7 questions is probably on the lower end, but about right, the number of questions you might ask. And then of that, you might say none of those are to be incorrect, or 1, depending on how you've structured it. But more like if you ask 12 questions, then you can probably get 1 wrong. So that's one thing to think about. But then within that, there's also some nuance as well, right? So you've got a requirement that says you can take the test twice, so you can fail it once and take it again. But after that second attempt, every future attempt, you need to have at least 24 hours break before you allow them to take that test again. So there's a build challenge there, but there's also a governance challenge, right? And that governance challenge is ultimately that you are having to decide whether between tests you give more time than 24 hours. So let's say they fail 4 times. Is it still okay to only give a 24-hour break, or should you be giving a 2-day break or a 3-day break to give people time to learn what they need to understand in order to pass that test and in order to therefore safely interact with the product or service?
And at some point, you've got to ask the question: after how many failures, is this just not the right thing for somebody to be getting into at all? And that's a call to be made. So you've kind of got to deal with the have enough of a break and enough attempts that you can help people to learn about it, so that we can open the door to people getting involved in this stuff, versus having so many attempts that people that just should not be doing this are not getting involved at all. And also, you're going to have some leeway too, right, for fat finger moments or whatever, because a lot of these things will be done via apps. It'll be people on small screens on phones going through it. There is some margin for error in completing it, but that's going to be quite a small margin, really. That's not a 5 times fat finger moment, is it? I wouldn't have expected.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. The one other thing on this is, of course, what happens at the end of that test, because you're going to be saying to people, in some cases, you failed, and is that it? Do you just say you failed, take it again? Or do you say you failed on these topics because you answered these questions incorrectly, and therefore you should learn more about X, Y, or Z topic. Oh, and by the way, here's some educational materials that we've put together that you can go away and learn about stuff. And as long as you're not, so there's a rule in there, I'm going to quote it badly, but that you can't coach, again, use that coaching word, you can't coach someone to retake the test. You can't sort of force it. They've got to do it of their own volition. And of course, the best way to do that is if they do that of their own volition after they've gone away and learned about it and then come back. There's a communication piece to think about there as well, right? How do you notify users, and do you remind them that they've still not completed the assessment, that they should come back and do it? I think you can probably do that if it's factual versus if it's like, hey, you want to come and trade? Quick, do your test. I think that would be probably the wrong side of that line. But certainly factual notifications that say, you can come back now and take that test again would be okay. And in the meantime, here's a load of educational material that we've got that you can learn from.
And this is where stuff like the style and readability of language comes in handy too, because the simplicity of language for the average reading age always feels far more simple when you read it than you expect it to for someone who understands this stuff. You read something really simple, and that's really, really basic, but actually it probably should be basic, because someone who just doesn't know this stuff at the beginning or isn't familiar with some of the jargon and the language that's used needs it to be that level. And so when you're writing education materials, exactly as you've said, you can't say in the assessment we will ask you this question and the answer is that, because that's too close to coaching. But you can give the right information for them to get the questions correct, but you just got to make sure that it's readable and understandable, so that A, they actually can learn something, but B, that's how you're going to keep people engaged. Because if you just say, learn more here, and take them to a link that's full of documents with loads of jargon and technical language and it's 100 pages long, to your earlier point about engagement, no one's going to be interested in reading that. They're going to just be put off completely. So some good sort of simple, succinct information is good to provide, as long as it's not so closely linked to the assessment questions that it really does look like it's just coaching people through it.
Mm-hmm. And it is worth bearing in mind that you can't, as you alluded to, show which answer is the right one when you show them how they did on the test, mm-hmm. because that's too close to coaching. You'll ultimately just be able to then memorize which one had the green tick next to it and take it again until you get that question and get it right. So you can't do that. And of course, your training materials can't, again, copy paste the sort of answer text. It has to just explain the concepts and the topics, not be a way of someone just opening a PDF on their other screen and say, okay, great, which of that text is in this question? Mm-hmm. So there's a bit of, it's always got to be sort of built in isolation, but on the basis that it's useful. And then interestingly, one thing that firms might consider as part of the build is then whether they have a way of showing how successful some of that educational material was. So do they have a tracker that says, okay, well, user came off the test, went to the section on staking, read the section on staking, it came back, and as a result of that, passed the test the next time? That would be interesting and useful information to gather, probably, and not inappropriate use of your technology.
And that's true of everything that we've talked about through the frictions. Is there's some regulatory requirement to report on the frictions, so the numbers of customers, who's taking it, etc. But there's a lot of really useful information for a business to understand about its market and its customers from the process of going through the frictions, like you said. So we've already covered how many high net worth versus certified sophisticated versus retail or restricted have we got. How many entered the frictions process, how many stopped halfway through, how many failed it 6 times but got it the 7th or never came back again afterwards, how many clicked on the learning links. Loads of really useful stuff there, and that is what we can use to help evolve the process over time, because this doesn't have to be a one and done process. I don't think anyone expects that. We don't want to be continuously spending developer time on frictions, obviously, but I think the more it can be tweaked and enhanced from learning, the better.
Yeah, agree. Okay. And so next port is the last one, which is the 24-hour cooling off period. And a couple of considerations here. When it starts, how you're communicating that somebody is in that period, and then what you communicate when it ends. So when you want to pick up on any of those?
Yeah, nice and easy. So when it starts, there's obviously different options and different ways to determine when the cooling off period starts, and then actually when it ends. So kind of what you don't want is for it to start and finish before anybody's finished other parts of the frictions process, which isn't particularly helpful. In addition to that, there's what you do to people who start the cooling off period and never reappear. So reminding them that they are in a cooling off period or were in a cooling off period, and now that's come out the other side. And one of the big things there is to make it, as we've said before, quite factual. So if someone's completed it, you can tell them that they've completed it and that they may wish to come and revisit. But if it feels really like a marketing exercise, pulling people in as opposed to just being a fairly neutral communication, then it's probably going to cross the line a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's right. One nuance there, of course. So when you start, so the first time you start that timer ticking should be at the point that an investor says, I would like to see your direct offer financial promotion, which is effectively your buy button, right, or your exchange button. So I would like to see that and be able to interact with it. And so usually what happens is a pop-up will appear. Hey, it looks like you want to carry out a controlled activity. Please confirm that you do intend or would like to see that button or that promotion over there. Noting that if you click confirm, the 24-hour cooling off period will start. So great. Someone ticks to see the app or the promotion, pop-up appears, and then the cooling off period starts. Now, what we've had insinuated, although not directly guided on, is what then happens. So, for instance, some builds were doing that and then ultimately allowing users back onto the site, but still without doing any activities, until such time as they sort of tried to interact again or registered to do something. And then the rest of the frictions appeared. So the personalised risk warning, the categorisation and the assessment. And there's a sort of interminable gap in the middle. And it could be a very short gap and it could be months. At which point, of course, 24 hours would have elapsed in that latter case. And so they'd be just going through the rest of the frictions without any timer sort of running. And there's no indication really that they still recall that first interaction. And so the guidance that we've had is, or the insinuation that we've had is, that it's more appropriate to batch all that together into one block, so users can sign up for your thing and your app, and they can see the app or the platform. And what they can't do is any controlled activities. But as soon as they do, then bam, all four of those frictions kick in, and a 24-hour cooling off period starts. And you might think about having a little whirly clock in the top of the screen whilst that process is happening. And of course, your other frictions might happen within 10-15 minutes of starting that process, in which case you've got 23 hours and 50 minutes left to wait, and you'll tell them that. Or it might be that the process starts and it takes them a bit of time to do the questions, get the test right, because ultimately, if you get it wrong twice, then you've got to wait within the test bit another 24 hours. So it could be 2-3 days later by the time you've done that, at which point the cooling off period will have ended. So that's fine, because that's just the natural order of things. And the other thing that the FCA says you can do in that time is actually all your KYB and onboarding stuff. Or KYC, sorry. So, get your passports, get your ID docs or whatever it is that you need for your money laundering requirements. And equally, as part of that process, getting that information means that you get the customer's name so that you can send them the personalised risk warning, because otherwise you'd have had to find that information from somewhere else. So there's a bit of nuance to play with there, just to think about how you structure all that together. But ultimately, it's just, again, it's a build. And I suppose a parting thought on the 4 frictions generally is that I've been surprised that from the clients that we've worked with, at least, most of them wanted to build that and own that process themselves, rather than hire it in or buy it in from a provider offering friction services. Of course, there's an element of control there, which is important. But note that sometimes there's multi-layered models where you might just be taking somebody else's rails and white labeling them. So let's say you take somebody's app and then just white label it to be your own. They'll be the ones providing all that friction stuff. And of course, there's nuances in that model too, because then you've got things like because there's a requirement that the questions have to cover your service, so you're testing whether users understand your service and how your business does things and what rights they've got. And if that's different in your case to the underlying product provider's case, then you're going to need to amend their appropriateness assessment to make sure that you're testing it in a compliant way for you. So yeah, a lot of nuance in that multi-level model that needs to be thought through. Probably not one to go into now, but yeah, any final thoughts from you on the whole shebang?
I think the key bit for me is for firms to look at it from 3 perspectives, really, because we're trying to join up 3 dots here. One is, what is it that the FCA are actually saying in prescribed rules that has to happen? So that's almost the easier bit to deal with, because if they said it's got to happen like that, it's got to happen like that. As we see with things like risk warnings and processes and stuff, you just got to do it to get that done. Then the next bit is, what do you as a business want to achieve with the frictions, acknowledging that they have to exist in the form that they've been given to you. So can we learn from it? What data can we take from the frictions? And how can we make sure that it's not just the tick box exercise, but it's actually helping us as a business make sure that the customers that we're interacting with know what it is that they're getting, and what the risks are, etc. Because that, as we said, is just going to give you better customers, because now they know what's to be expected. So there's going to be fewer surprises. And then the third element is to kind of put yourself in the customer's shoes. So if I imagine I'm a customer, and testing it with real customers is a great idea too. So if I'm a customer, how does this feel to me? So we've had people test this for us and write up reports to give us their perspective, because we're in this all day, every day, as are the clients that we've got. And so there are sort of little nuances and little things that you maybe miss out on, or don't necessarily think about. And that is with a view to not just making the frictions harder, but as we said before, making sure the frictions are as nice an experience as they can be, and where people can't pass any of those for any reason because the explanation isn't good, then giving them that extra information in a way that they'll understand.
Great. And that is the pod.
Yeah, and that lasted a lot longer than I thought it was going to this time on frictions, but there's so much nuance with it. I guess it's important just to make the point, though, that once you sort of sit down with people and start to go through this stuff, we're kind of learning a lot as we go, aren't we? From clients, from regulators, from competitors, from what's happening elsewhere, that we're starting to see a bit more of a generally common approach to it, or at least that's where we think we'll end up and we'll land.
And keep your eyes peeled for the FCA's guidance on good and bad practice in this space, which will no doubt land any day now.
Yep, exactly. And then we'll discuss that in a new one.
Sounds good. All right.
Cool.
See you next week.
Until next time. Goodbye.